Before we get started, I want to take just a moment to tell you how you can go deeper with these stories. If you enjoy Dauphin Island Diaries, you can support the show on Patreon. Patreon subscribers get early access to every episode, ad-free listening, and a monthly newsletter. Premium Patreon subscribers also get bonus content, including full-length interviews and behind-the-scenes material. You can find that at patreon.com/Summers Media Enterprises. Now, let's get into the story. Welcome to Dauphin Island Diaries. This is a podcast dedicated to the history of Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Gulf Coast that surrounds it. Twice each month, we bring you a story about the people, the places, and the moments that have shaped this island and the waters and coastline beyond it. Some of these stories are well known. Others have been buried by time and storms and shifting shorelines, but they're still here. So wherever you are, whether you're on the island, remembering it, or discovering it for the first time, find a comfortable place, take a deep breath, relax, and settle in, because this is one of those stories. Everybody talks about the gorgeous sunsets on Dauphin Island, and for good reason. They are stunning. They really are. But the sun also rises on the other side of the bay, and those sunrises are just as amazing. Maybe in some ways even more so. Part of me thinks that in that world that existed here before the bridge, when life was much more secluded and in many ways much simpler, the people who lived here were probably more accustomed to seeing the sun rises than the sun sets. Working people, people of the land and of the water, they tend to be early risers. I suspect that it was thus for the fishermen and shrimpers and oystermen who lived on the island long before those Mobile businessmen saw Dauphin Island as a development opportunity, before they subdivided the island, before the first bridge was built, before the country club and the water tower, before Bienville Boulevard was the smooth twin ribbon of pavement the length of the main part of the island. Speaking in particular of the Oystermen, in those days, people were up early, out on the water early, ready with their tongs and baskets, and by the time the sun had cleared the horizon, they would have already been raking the bottoms as they worked those oyster beds. That wasn't a day of recreation. It was a way of life. It was how they lived. It was how they survived. You have to look to find those guys these days on Dauphin Island. There aren't nearly as many of them now, and there are instead a whole lot more people around like me, people from somewhere else. But those people who were the heartbeat of this island for generations, they can still be found if you look for them. They're still here, even if there aren't as many of them as there once were. And the canneries that took those fresh oysters and preserved them in shiny metal cylinders, there were once a whole group of them in Bayou Batre called Cannery Row. They're all gone now. And a substantial part of the oyster beds are gone now too. And regulations prevent oystering for nearly half the year. But back in the day, it was a way of life, daily life, for a sizable portion of the island's residents, as well as those on the nearby mainland. So before Dauphin Island became a tourist destination, before the West Beach became clogged with beach houses on stilts crowded on top of one another, it was, in effect, a year-round fish camp. The houses of those who went out and worked the water every day dotted the island. Their livestock, cows and pigs and goats, kept the undergrowth eaten back. There wasn't any electricity yet. Cooking was done on wood-burning cook stoves. Illumination was provided by kerosene lamps. A daily postal ferry brought the mail. No cell phones or landlines. The kids on the island went to school starting in the 1930s. It was in the little red schoolhouse, though it wasn't painted red until later. No television, no internet, working to survive. Survival is simple. Harder than now, perhaps, but simpler. In those days, the oysters were still plentiful. Probably not an awful lot different from the days of the Native Americans who had created the shell mounds on the island. Those Indians, as they were once commonly known, had plied the shallow waters of Dauphin Island Bay and found the oysters to be plentiful there. The middens of Indian shell mounds provide evidence for that claim, even though it took hundreds and hundreds of years to create them. That is still a lot of oysters that were consumed there and the remains left behind in those mounds. And in the late 1800s and the first few decades of the 1900s, that continued. Pictures are easily found of that period when the boats of the Oystermen in Secour Bay and Mississippi Sound appear almost to be swamped from the weight of the oysters piled on their decks. The oysters are piled in a huge mound towering several feet tall and outward to the tops of the gunnels, and those are only inches above the surface of the water. So that naturally begs the question, what happened? Was it overharvesting? Was it a natural disaster? Or was there another problem? And those are all legitimate questions. Some studies I've seen suggest that the Mobile Bay has lost over 80% of its historic levels of oysters. And finding the smoking gun for what caused that massive decline isn't necessarily a simple task, but that's because there doesn't seem to be one single answer to those questions. Now, the first easy and obvious answer seems to be they overharvested the oysters. That is the easy and obvious answer. But if it is a correct answer, and evidence suggests that it is probably one correct answer, it certainly isn't the only answer. The state of Alabama had among the earliest laws governing the harvest of oysters anywhere in the country. Some of those laws, which began to be formulated even before the Civil War in the 1850s, started to appear in codified form in 1867. Notable among these provisions are a ban on all mechanical harvesting in Alabama waters other than by rakes or tongs. While this doesn't in and of itself prevent overharvesting, it does make it a little harder for this to happen than if a mechanical means such as oyster dredging were used. Large quantities of oysters were certainly harvested, it's true, but when the reefs are healthy, oyster populations breed prodigiously and rebound pretty quickly when they're healthy. When they're not, then harvesting so aggressively can remove more oysters than the environment can keep up with replacing. And speaking of dredging, this may be another piece of the puzzle that could help to explain why the reefs weren't healthy and were unable to replace what was harvested. And we're not talking about dredging like what's used in harvesting oysters in some places, but rather the large-scale dredging of the oyster reefs themselves to take the oyster shell substrate out. If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on Dauphin Island Diaries, there's another show you might want to check out, The Tennessee History Nerd. Same approach, different setting. Stories from across the volunteer state rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, let's get back to our story. Starting in the 1940s, the oyster shell substrate of reefs around the area began to be harvested on a wholesale scale. Oyster shell is desirable for a number of applications, primarily in construction contexts. And thousands of tons of oyster shell was dredged from the reefs in the area. This was not beneficial to the reefs. That is probably self-evident. By way of explanation, healthy oyster reefs will often have generations of oyster shells layered beneath the current layer. Oyster eggs are fertilized in the water around adult oysters, and oyster larvae hatch and are suspended in the water. Eventually, they must settle in and attach to something, and that typically is the substrate of an oyster reef. As oysters attach to the substrate on the floor of a body of water, they live, mature, reproduce potentially several times in their lives, and then ultimately they die there. Once they attach, they're attached for life. And then when they die, their shell is added to the existing substrate on the bottom to which future oyster larvae will in turn attach to. And those in turn will go through the same life cycle. This cycle is, under normal conditions, repeated year after year. And thus, over the centuries, strata of oyster shell will layer a reef, be compressed over the years, break down some, but will continue to be substrate for future generations of oysters. And because of this, healthy, established oyster reefs can be many feet thick with this substrate comprised of previous generations. And this is what was being harvested by those dredgers starting in the 1940s, destroying almost instantly literally hundreds, potentially even thousands of years of oyster substrate accumulation and hauling it away. Not only were hundreds, perhaps thousands of acres of oyster reefs destroyed in this way, the excessive siltation of the waters caused by this dredging also buried many of the oyster reefs that survived and greatly impacted the oxygenation of the water, thus damaging the nearby reefs that were otherwise untouched by the dredging. Adding insult to injury, over the course of the early to mid 20th century, the Intracoastal Waterway was created. In some cases, such as with the Mississippi Sound, existing waterways were deepened by dredging the channels, while in others, canals were created. To put things in perspective, during the Civil War, Admiral David Farragut attempted to attack Fort Powell in the Mississippi Sound by coming in from the west from the Petit Bois Island side, what the locals call Petit Boy Island, from the Sound, but was unable to get close enough to the island to attack because the Sound was too shallow. Likewise, he was unable to take his warships all the way to Mobile to attack the port there because of the shallowness of Mobile Bay. Today, thanks to the dredging of the channels down from Mobile and across through the Mississippi Sound, larger ships with deeper drafts routinely sail both the bay and the Sound because the channels in both have been dredged. This is good for commercial shipping, of course, but it has proven to have something of a detrimental effect on the oyster population. And in perhaps another surprising impact, flooding even hundreds of miles inland can release large amounts of fresh water into the Gulf. In a January 2025 Alabama Reflector article, Lee Smee, an environmental fellow at the University of South Alabama, said, "Flooding in Nebraska can kill oysters in the Gulf." That reference went on to say, what's known as the Bonnet Carr Spillway routes the Mississippi River around New Orleans to keep the city from flooding. When there's extensive flooding upstream as far away as Nebraska, the spillway is opened and fresh water flows through the Mississippi River into the Gulf, reducing the salinity for several weeks. And according to Smee, several weeks is too long for oysters to tolerate. The same thing can happen in Mobile Bay. Flooding to the north on the Tennessee River in northern Alabama or even East Tennessee can find its way down the Tombigbee Waterway into the Mobile River and into the bay. The same is true with the Tombigbee itself, or the Coosa River, or the Cahaba River, or the Tallapoosa River, or the Alabama River, or any other tributary that ultimately feeds into the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. Flooding to the north will eventually hit the bay with a bolus of fresh water. Too much fresh water hitting the bay's ecosystem too fast? That can kill oysters. Additionally, if the freshwater infusion happens during spawning season, Either the adults won't spawn or the highly vulnerable larvae won't survive and be able to attach to substrate. So even if they survive, the adult oysters that go into survival mode aren't able effectively to reproduce. That means no new oysters replacing oysters that are being harvested or lost to the conditions. Either way, that spawning season is lost, and those oysters that would have been produced otherwise during that season now won't be. If you're a business with a strong connection to history, education, travel, or place based storytelling, and you're looking to reach an audience that values those things, we should talk. You can reach me at john.summers at summersmediaenterprises.com. Now, let's get back to our story. Even so, the influx of fresh water into the bay's ecosystem isn't always a bad thing. Jason Herman, the biologist for the oyster management program with the Alabama Marine Resources Division, told me that if the water is too saline for too long, a type of predatory snail known as drills will often move in to prey upon the oysters. While the oysters themselves can tolerate that higher salinity, they don't have the ability to defend against the drills which bore through their shells, consume the oyster inside. The only real weapon against those drills is an infusion of fresh water into the system. The drills can't tolerate that as long as the oysters themselves can. A lot like chemotherapy is toxic to both patient and cancer, but the patient can tolerate the toxicity better and longer than the cancer usually can. So also are the oysters able better to tolerate that lack of salinity for a short time than the drills are. So when the drills move into a reef and begin consuming it, they'll usually either completely destroy a reef and then die of starvation, or they'll die from an infusion of fresh water that they're unable to tolerate. But even though the lack of salinity will kill the drills, sustained freshwater exposure will also eventually kill the oysters. So even nature can take out reefs under the right circumstances. Another problem is caused by siltation from man made projects. In some cases, it's the result of construction projects where erosion is permitted to enter the water where the reefs are. In other cases, it's actually the result of intentional mud dumping from the dredging operations to expand the channel in the bay for commercial shipping, as we alluded earlier. A report in 1819 News from May 12, 2025 stated, "The dumping is from the Port of Mobile deepening and widening project to allow larger ships into the channel." The same report noted that Mobile Baykeeper said that the plan was to dump around 90 million cubic yards of spoil and mud into Mobile Bay over the next 20 years. That is equivalent to more than 42,000 football fields of sludge. Additionally, the article stated Alabama Commercial Fishermen Association Secretary Kerry Mitchell said the dumping is impacting the shrimping and oyster business, and that Mitchell stated the baykeepers are upset about it because they want to keep that bay clean, and we want to keep it clean because it's our livelihood. When you consider all the things that we've noted here, it's no surprise that the oyster population of the bay has decreased by over 80%. All these things taken into account, the surprise may actually be that nearly a fifth of the population still survives now at all. And what's very important to understand is that the oyster reefs are integral to the health of the bay. Oysters are part of the bay's natural filtration system. They live off the phytoplankton in the water. The bay is naturally murky. That doesn't mean that it should be like what used to be said of the Mississippi River, too thick to drink and too thin to plow. When the water is that full of sediment, it impacts the oxygenation of the water, and it's not healthy for a lot of the aquatic life, especially shrimps and oysters. But crystal clear water means nothing is suspended in the water for the oysters to eat. There's no phytoplankton in the water for them to filter out. It's sterile, like a chlorinated swimming pool. I had the good fortune to attend a Gulf chat at the National Maritime Museum of the Gulf on May 21st, 2026. The speaker for that session was Roberta Swan, the former director of the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program. She managed that program for about 2 decades and retired from it back in January 2026. One of the things that I took from her presentation is the importance of involving people from a lot of different disciplines and pursuits, all of whom have skin in the game of promoting and ensuring the health of the bay and the estuaries that feed it, while ensuring that commerce and development can grow too. She likened it to making gumbo, all the different ingredients and flavors that influence the outcome of things. While she didn't speak at length specifically about the oyster industry, she did talk about things that impact the health of the bay, like the deployment of things such as the litter getter that help to catch trash and litter and pollutants before they make it into the bay itself. Because the goal is that the health of the bay improve. And restoring those oyster reefs is important because when the bay is full of those healthy reefs, and when those reefs are doing their job, then the water is being cleaned as it should be. It's healthier for everything in that water. But as bleak as all of this might sound, there are rays of sunlight peeking through. First of all, even though there are many fights left to be fought, there are people who are joining the fight. For example, in addition to the National Estuary Program, the Mobile Bay Keepers, the Alabama Commercial Fishermen Association, and others are pushing back against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with the dumping of silt. Now, the Corps of Engineers has an important job to do with keeping the shipping channels clear and navigable, and that's a challenge. And there's a balance that must be kept. Commerce and shipping feed the economy. And to be completely honest, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't fascinated every time I see a big cargo ship make its way into the bay or watch them being guided up the Mobile River by tugboats. And that shipping is essential to the economy of the area. And if the channel isn't kept open, that doesn't happen. So what the Corps of Engineers is doing in keeping those channels open really is truly important. But what gets done sometimes with that dredged material is where the problem comes in, such as when it's just scattered wholesale around the bay, which is probably among the easiest ways to dispose of it. But that has a very detrimental effect on the health of the bay and on the reefs that support the bay's health, and on the aquatic life that supports commercial fishing, which is also very important to the local economy as well. If you've been enjoying Dauphin Island Diaries, there's a way to take a little piece of it with you. We've got merchandise available, shirts, hats, and more, so you can represent the show wherever you go. You can check that out at summersmediaenterprises.com/merch. And as always, thanks for listening. And now, let's return to the story. The important thing is finding balance and ways to maintain viable shipping channels while also preserving and maintaining the aquatic life and ecosystems of the area. So, the work being done to restore the existing reefs by the baykeepers, by the Alabama Marine Resources, and even by individuals who care, people who are creating oyster gardens, oystermen who are returning oyster shelter reefs to help rebuild the substrate, people who are finding different ways to contribute. All those efforts aggregate to make a difference. So basically what we're talking about is restoring the oyster reefs through aquaculture, kind of like restoring forests through replanting trees, forestry. And these reefs are on bottom reefs. Aquaculture, where spats, that is, young oysters that have recently attached themselves to a hard surface and begun growing there, they're being deposited in a particular area to create a reef. And that's old technology. Even the Romans practiced this technique thousands of years ago. And this kind of aquaculture can potentially help to restore at least some of the reefs where they were previously known to have existed, but now are collapsed. But it's an uphill battle. As Jason Herman said in my May 11, 2026 interview with him, Quote, all in all, across the Gulf, I think we're all in a decline. We have these little upswings and downswings, and we're all trying to get to historical levels and do whatever we can to do that. And Mother Nature just doesn't seem to want to give us a break all across the board, end quote. So while there are now concerted efforts to rebuild the reefs, there continue to be challenges, even with the aquacultural efforts to restore the wild reefs. But in recent years, a different kind of aquaculture has begun to show up around the bay and the entire Alabama Gulf Coast. Oyster farms. The Oysters Alabama website lists over a dozen oyster farming operations across the entire Alabama Gulf Coast. Grand Bay, Bayou, Batre, Montlouis Island, Dauphin Island, Navy Cove, Portersville Bay, Pelican Bay, Mississippi Sound, and Sullivan Bayou all boast oyster farms that are producing oysters through aquaculture. Many, if not most of these operations, use an off-bottom methodology. With those systems, oysters are suspended in baskets, bags, or containers near the surface. This helps to keep the oysters away from a lot of the predators like some of the drills. It also enables the farmers to control the density of the number of oysters. It lets them control the location. Their suspension near the surface lets them be in water that is richer in phytoplankton and oxygen, and it enables the farmer to have more control over the shape of the oyster and to monitor size and readiness for harvest. This means that they have more control over what the oyster looks like for plating for premium oyster bar appearance. Thus, as the conditions evolve, as challenges arise, those in the industry adapt. Sure, there still are people harvesting oysters in the traditional way, and as long as those wild oysters are available, that likely will continue. And hopefully, through the efforts of organizations like the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program, the Mobile Bay Keepers, the Alabama Marine Resources Division, the Commercial Fishermen Association, as well as through the efforts of individuals, the oyster population will begin to rebound. But it will take continued vigilance and proactive conservation efforts and not just reacting to what already exists. In the meanwhile, if you like oysters, the proliferation of oyster farms means that the oyster industry is alive and well, in a very different way from what it existed in the past, to be sure, but it is producing oysters to meet the demand of consumers everywhere. And thanks to refrigeration, the canned oysters of the past have been mostly replaced by fresh oysters in places that are hundreds of miles away from the coast. You can walk into an oyster bar in Nashville, Tennessee, or St. Louis, Missouri, and get fresh oysters on the half shell. So, like a lot of other areas of life, the oyster industry isn't going away. It's actually maybe growing. But it's growing in a way that likely was never anticipated by those 1930s Dauphin Island oystermen rising at the crack of dawn to ease out on the water and start tonging oysters before the sun had even fully risen. It's adapting somewhat in the way local subsistence farming has grown into agribusiness megafarms. Only these farms are rows of oyster baskets suspended from lines rather than rows of corn or soybeans. And in both cases, it was adapt or die. And so even if the oyster industry is different today from how it was in the past, it's survived, it's adapted, it's evolved, but it's still here. So keep enjoying those oysters and maybe lend a hand to helping restore the reefs if you can. Back on May 11th, 2026, I had the opportunity to sit down with Alabama Marine Resources Division biologist Jason Herman to talk about the history of the oyster industry, oyster management, and the challenges the Alabama coast faces with restoring oyster population, along with a lot more. What follows is a short excerpt from that interview, but if you'd like to hear the entire session, you can find that on Patreon. The link to that
falls to
is
the bottom,
in the show
and
notes.
it becomes the substrate for the next oyster larvae to settle on. And if this happens successfully year after year, decade after decade, century after century, you have the establishment of growing reef. It actually grows a mound. The weight of it kind of pushes the earliest shell down into the substrate, but it still holds it. Its surface area will hold it. And this will continue until the next natural disaster, or if there happen to be over harvesting or something like that, that can bring a decline as well. I won't say over harvesting won't bring a decline, but again, it's been environmental factors here in Alabama.
So going back to where we were talking about back in the 1940s, where you had the situations with the dredging of the oyster reefs and pulling all the substrate out. How many centuries? Or let me just that's a leading question. Let me just ask, how many years would that likely have taken with it that they had been in that position, or is there even any way to tell? I mean, it could have changed through storms and those kinds of things, obviously, but
I think easily I'd say several hundred years, but honestly, until people become more efficient at harvesting and really are able to, or more efficient at dredging in that case, there wasn't much that affected those reefs. So I would say definitely hundreds of years of buildup of those reefs were removed, possibly even 1,000.
So how does the depth of water affect things? And so was there any impact by dredging and making the water much deeper there in terms of oyster reproduction then after that?
So the depth can affect them. So generally, if they're under 12 feet, 9 feet, or below, the mixing of the water can bring oxygen down to the bottom and bring the nutrients down. If you start having deeper water, you could get into situations, and we have certain reefs that have become unproductive because of low oxygen. They have low dissolved oxygen, and it's mainly because the oxygen just doesn't get that mixing down to that depth. Low oxygen is also tied to salinity and temperature of water during the hottest parts of the year. You have the tendency to have lower oxygen. So with where we are right now, right out here is the bay. Behind the building here are where the middens are. This is where if the archaeological studies that I've read are correct, they came down from Bottle Creek in the prehistoric period, in the Mississippian period. They came down here. This is where they set up. They had this ring of mounds here. When I was talking to John Maresca a few weeks ago when I was here, this would have been much shallower at that time. Yes.
And so they could have waited out and harvested those things very easily. Wouldn't have, our guys now have the tongs that they use, the long handled, reach in and grab that would not have been necessary. They could have done this by hand just about.
Yes, they could have done that by hand, and I'm sure plenty of folks do it. Even these days, some folks will still get out and harvest by hand. The majority is tongers. But the Native Americans also developed rakes from the materials that they had, and very similar to what we use today, too. So let's see, in the 1750s or so, some of the French explorers and things that came by had witnessed some of those things and logged some of those. That wasn't necessarily in the Gulf, but that's, folks figure out the best ways to do things.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, where I was really going with this, it had to do with how the conditions would have been different, with it being shallow enough that they could have harvested by hand. It wouldn't have needed necessarily to have the tongs, rakes, those kinds of things. How would that have been different from an environmental, ecological type of a situation for the growth and sustained existence of oysters in this area right now? Because it's much less than it used to be.
Yeah, so I think, oysters that are closer to the surface I don't know if you've looked out into our bay, and it's kind of brown and
Murky now.
and murky. A lot of turbulence and a lot of sediment gets turned over on a regular basis. I think oysters, at least here near the surface, have access to more phytoplankton. So those are the things that they filter out as the marine algae. And of course, algae is a plant. They need light. They're going to do better near the surface than underneath the murky water. Doesn't mean they're not mixed in and that they can't get to them down there, but on some of our oyster farms.
So that's going to do it for this episode of Dauphin Island Diaries. Episode 4, The World is Your Oyster. But we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode, and the next time we're going to zoom out away from Dauphin Island and the bay a little bit and look at a little-known episode in the history of the larger Gulf Coast in Episode 5, The Forgotten Republic. I hope you'll be watching for that episode to drop when we again explore where memories intermingle with the sand, the waves, and the wind. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, and these are Dauphin Island Diaries. May you enjoy fair winds today and a beautiful Dauphin Island sunset. Before we close completely today, I wanted to take a moment to share where I got the information for this episode. Special attention in the research for this episode was given to my May 11th, 2026 interview with Jason Herman of the Alabama Marine Resources Division, whose insight into oyster biology, oyster management, environmental pressures, restoration efforts, aquaculture, and the history of the Alabama oyster industry was invaluable in helping to shape this episode. Additional insight and context came from attending the May 21st, 2026 Gulf Chat presentation at the National Maritime Museum of the Gulf, featuring Roberta Swan, former director of the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program, entitled A Yankee Does Good, Stirring Gumbo, Raising Ruckus, and Cleaning Water. Additional source material and reference information for this episode came from Mobile Baykeeper, the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program website, Alabama Marine Resources Division resources, the Alabama Reflector, Mobile Bay Magazine, Alabama Buzz, 1819 News, NPR, OBA News, and other publicly available environmental and historical resources concerning the oyster industry, oyster reef restoration, aquaculture, environmental management, and the ecological history of Mobile Bay and the Alabama Gulf Coast. Research for this episode included source material related to oyster gardening, shell recycling, reef restoration, aquaculture methods, salinity impacts, oyster drill predation, shell dredging history, Mobile Bay spoil dumping concerns, and the environmental impact of changing conditions in the bay and estuary systems. A complete listing may be found in the episode notes for today's show. As always, I want to thank these folks for their work in providing the documentation that is the lifeblood of this kind of work, and I encourage you to check into these sources yourself. You'll be glad you did. And thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's more where this came from. Over on Patreon, you'll find our full catalog, plus you can get early access to episodes, ad-free listening, and bonus content that goes beyond what's included here. Signing up for a paid subscription to Patreon is the best way to support the show and to get more out of it at the same time. That's patreon.com/Summers Media Enterprises. And thanks for listening.